Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Our panel is going to examine administrative bloat and how it impairs the progress of a $10,000 degree. And we're fortunate to have three panelists that know a lot about this issue and will be telling us about it. To give you and the audience some background on this issue, let me just say a couple of things. And by the way, my name is Tom Lindsay, and I direct the Center for Higher Education here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. There was a study that came out 2 years ago in the form of a book, but what caught the attention wasn't the book, but the article that was spun off from the book that appeared in the Washington Monthly. And the title of the article really conveys the thesis of this panel. The title of the article by Professor Benjamin Ginsberg was this. It was called "Administrators Ate My Tuition." And it was spun off from his book, The Fall of the Faculty, in which he shows how the explosion in administration in the last 40 years has come largely at the expense of teaching and learning. That is to say, has come largely at the expense of the central function of our universities. Now, in Administrators Ate My Tuition, he documents certainly what I and my colleagues who have worked in universities, I worked as a professor and as an administrator, something that we have sensed for a long time. Administration has mushroomed at the expense of every other sector on campus. Quoting Ginsberg, 40 years ago, U.S. colleges employed more faculty than administrators. That shouldn't be a surprise. After all, teaching and learning is the central purpose of a university. But today, Ginsberg found, teachers make up less than half of college employees. And the raw numbers really tell the story. 40 years ago, the efforts of roughly 450,000 professors were supported by about 250,000 administrators and staffers. But over the last 4 decades, although the number of professors has increased slightly with the increase in student population, it has only increased 50%. The number of administrators, staffers, and others in that area employed by the same schools increased an astonishing 85%. Staffers alone increased 240% during the same period. Between 1975 and the year 2000, the number of administrators and managers employed by our public institutions increased by 66%. As bad as that is, at the private universities, they increased 135%. But our concern here is with public institutions. Now, what do these increases add up to in dollars? Adjusting for inflation from 1947 to 1995, overall university spending increased 148%. But administrative spending during the same period increased 235%. But teaching budgets increased only 128%, 20 points less than the overall rate of university spending. Now, Ginsberg's study also finds that senior administrators have done very well under the new regime. From 1998 to 2003, deans and vice presidents saw their salaries increase by as much as 50%. And by 2007, the median salary paid to the president of a doctoral granting institution was on average $325,000 a year, with 81 presidents across the country earning more than $500,000 and 12 earning more than $1 million. Now, all of us know that higher education is threatened by an affordability crisis. It's threatened by a student loan crisis. Tuition across the country has increased 440% in this country over the last 25 years. 3 times faster than inflation, faster even than the rate of health care costs during the same period. But even with that knowledge, that students are struggling to pay. Student loan debt is now at $1.2 trillion. For the first time in history, student loan debt is more than total national credit card debt. Right? But even with all of that pressure, a study by the Higher Education Report conducted last year showed that universities are still spending more on administration than they are on teaching and learning, even in light of this crisis. Now, how does this affect the $10,000 degree? It's pretty clear, I think, to see. And for those of you not familiar with the genesis of the $10,000 degree, in February of 2011, Governor Rick Perry, in his State of the State address, using his bully pulpit, challenged our public universities to offer $10,000 degrees. Now, $10,000 meaning $10,000 total for 4 years, tuition, fees, and books. Now, at the time that he made that challenge, there was a lot of skepticism. And that's understandable. The average public university in Texas was $27,000 average for 4 years, and the prices only seem to be going up. People said it couldn't happen, but within a year, Texas A&M San Antonio announced a $10,000 degree. Now we were just talking about UT Arlington's $10,000 degree. Now we have at least 13 universities in Texas that are offering $10,000 degrees. And we have the governor of Florida asking all of Florida universities to adopt $10,000 degrees. I've been contacted by legislators in Oregon and Oklahoma looking to do the same thing. So what was said to be impossible 2 years ago now appears to becoming a national trend. So with all this by way of introduction, to our panel, it's my honor to introduce our three panelists. To my immediate right here, Representative Jim Murphy, who represents West Houston, District 133. Welcome.
Thank you.
Next to him is Ron Trowbridge. Ron was just recently elected a trustee at Lone Star College, and Ron also has a PhD. Ron, welcome. And then I think friends of TPPF have known someone who's been a frequent guest here, Commissioner Raymond Paredes, Commissioner of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Welcome. We'll begin with Representative Murphy.
Well, thank you and good afternoon. Tom, thanks for having us here, and it's good to see you again. We got to work a good bit this past session, and I appreciate the work you've done particularly. I want to start with thanking TPPF for convening this event, for bringing attention to major issues, not just this, but others around our state, allowing us to explore some conservative issues to addressing them. That's what we're trying to do here. This is really an ideal point for us in the legislative cycle because we're going to return here in about a year to start considering our bills and filing our bills. So now is a great time for us to kind of flesh out some ideas, explore some issues, and see where we want to take our state. Let me start by saying how well higher education is doing in Texas, and in fact nationwide. The U.S. system is still the envy of the world, and that's testified to by the abundance of foreign students in our colleges, the ongoing efforts of other nations to study and emulate the U.S. system, and we have a record number of students enrolled in our schools, unprecedented levels of philanthropic support, and we're certainly setting new highs for the amount of business funds, private sector funds, flowing into our colleges for activities like research and development. While I come to praise higher education, not to bury it, I will point out that the fact remains that our relative success may be one of the greatest impediments to our efforts to initiate real reform and improvement. Because to consider the full picture of success, you have to bear in mind, and some of these Dr. Lindsay talked about, since 1980, inflation-adjusted tuition has doubled at our private schools, tripled at our public universities. Here in Texas, we may know, but I'll remind you, our college tuition has increased 99% over the last 10 years. We also have to account for, thinking about the quality matrix, of the growing number of graduates wondering if their education matters as they look for meaningful work with a less than valuable degree. Both public expenditures, and as Tom told you, $1.2 trillion of student debt, these levels are the highest they've ever been, and our university management systems to deal with this are largely rooted in the past. Education policymakers and those concerned with such matters see clearly that yesterday's performance, yesterday's standards will not suffice given the significant demographic changes underway here in Texas. More students are attending college as the first generation in their family to do so, and a broader cohort of students, often case less prepared, is in our college classrooms today. Educating these students calls for a different process, albeit a rigorous one. This need to refocus our mission, recalibrate our standards, and demand higher performance is further underscored by what's going on in our economy. Fewer jobs today, while we're leading the nation in job creation, and by far and away, fewer jobs being created today will require a high school degree or less. And most of them in fact, require a 2-year or 4-year degree, technical training, or professional certification. This growth in jobs and the skills they require is a huge challenge for the higher education system, but I've got to point out the other element, and we heard about this quite a bit this past session, and that's the graying of the workforce. 10,000 baby boomers a day reach the retirement age of 65. We need to replace these highly skilled, highly compensated workers in addition to filling the new jobs. I know from my work in economic development and serving as chairman of the subcommittee on manufacturing that this workforce issue is the issue for businesses in Texas. They can deal with taxes. They can figure out their regulations, and they can even fight their competitors. What they can't do on their own is build a workforce. So the challenges for higher education today are significant. Today we're zeroing in on the growth of administrative costs, and the comprehensive study provided by the Delta Cost Project, which you heard about from Dr. Lindsay, talked about this tremendous growth in administrative costs. I noted that from 1998 to 2008, administrative costs grew 50% faster than overall costs. And we talked about how the growth in faculty has been overshadowed by the growth in administrators and their staffs. I just have to repeat that staff number of 240% growth. I think we can safely call that bloat. And I look forward to working with my colleagues, you folks here today, and our stakeholders to try to address that. But I want to talk about a more expansive view of expenses and what drives them. And you have to include faculty costs, which comprise about 70% of the average budget. I want to talk about admin, but let's not forget 70% is faculty. Dr. Trowbridge has been outspoken on this issue, and I want to hear more from him. But there are efforts to increase the use of technology and things like online classes and distance learning. These reduce not just your faculty costs, but they also reduce your facilities costs, your operating costs, and generate a lower overall cost of education, which is really what we need to be chasing as we talk about keeping the degree affordable. Importantly, these new technologies provide greater access to students, whether it's in terms of time or geography. So it's critically important to Texas because we're a very spread out state. But these tools need to be considered as we seek to consider these lower costs. I want to go on a little bit of a soapbox here, and I can do that because I'm a guest at TPPF. We can't account for our cost drivers in education without considering the supply of funds that have taken us further from the free market. Students are rarely fully or personally responsible for funding their education, a system much like we have in healthcare. And I don't mean, Kendall, the parent funding here, but I refer to scholarships, grants, and increasingly government loans underwritten by our taxpayers and placing a huge burden on these students when they graduate. Taxpayers are rightfully questioning the value of these growing expenditures and underwriting as they realize the taxpayers are now vested in the success of the students as these students choose their course of study. While there is some debate as to the public's desire to fund a degree, there is no debate that they want that degree to help the student pay off the loan the taxpayers are guaranteeing. Another higher education consumer's voice has joined the chorus of students, families, and taxpayers calling for improvement, namely our businesses, the people who hire these graduates. Recall my comments earlier about workforce, what that means to them. These businesses get it, and their support for improvement and modernization is one of the key reasons we were able to pass such a significant education reform bill last session in House Bill 5. Their influence must continue and expand if we're to be successful. Looking to costs, and I mean now our costs as a state. We've got to look into the negative aspect of growth. We all want to grow, but let me just hear about the economic model. Higher education is a business that relies on non-consumer generated indirect revenue to balance the books. Taxes, state appropriations, and philanthropy are required to increase as we grow enrollment. Now, quick aside here, I'm going to tell an Aggie joke. I am a Longhorn. I'm allowed to tell Aggie jokes. We're required, actually, to do so. It's part of our graduation decree. But I will acknowledge very quickly, A&M won their bowl game. Okay, good job. So taxes, state appropriations, and philanthropy are required to increase with great enrollment. Much like the Aggies who decided to get rich by buying watermelons for $2 and selling them for $1, but making up for it with volume, we need to be prepared for much greater public funding. We lose money on every transaction. We need to be prepared for much greater public funding, doing nothing about costs, unless we start to address costs. Where I see even greater long-term benefit for our higher education and those who depend on it is an examination, a determination, if you will, of the results we desire. We can track enrollment, degrees, research dollars, etc., but is that all there is? When I was serving as a community college trustee, a new book swept through higher education and was considered quasi-revolutionary. You may recall or have read of Terry O'Banion's Learning College that emphasized learning over teaching. The guide at the side instead of the sage on the stage. That was kind of the clever saying from the book, Justin. You'll like that. But this book and the reaction to it confirmed that our focus had been misdirected for quite some time. Imagine a football team, which we had a bit of today. Imagine a football team's passing game focusing on throwing, but not on catching. But that's where we were. Yet now, some 10 years later, I ask, is it really our passing game that matters, or is it scoring touchdowns? A new wave of research is starting to look at the success of students once they complete their studies. Some of this data is hard, like what's your salary? Other parts are squishy, like are you satisfied? There will be other factors and ways to measure them. But the important element is that we direct our focus to outcomes because that's what determines value. After all, cheap is just cheap. This focus is what Purdue University and Gallup are starting this year with help from the Lumina Foundation. And this is not the only attempt to measure results, but I suggest ventures like this are what we here need to be considering and supporting. This new measurement offers an insight for consumers and supplements other information as they consider where to enroll, where to look for employees, or where to provide funding. By keeping an eye on cost and ensuring our higher education produces the desired results, we can best serve our educators, our students, and our taxpayers.
Thank you, Representative Murphy. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Trowbridge.
Having been a professor for 25 years and a college vice president for 14, it was inconceivable to me that you could teach Shakespeare online. I have no idea how you do that. On the other hand, it's being done. So I begin already by undermining online instruction by saying, I don't know how you do it. But then again, I don't have to do it anymore because I'm retired. Now, here's my paper. It's all data. I've put copies in the back in case you want any of the information, and I'll read it quickly. It's called How to Cut College Costs and Improve the Quality of Education. The University of Michigan's 2013 alumni newsletter, which I get because I went to the University of Michigan back in the 19th century when we played football. We don't anymore. Features a piece called Mokes, Me and Michigan by English professor Eric Robin. The evidence in it for MOOC, massive open online course instruction, is powerful in terms of reducing college costs while at the same time improving the quality of education. It is a godsend for low-income students. Rapkin writes, the co-founder Daphne Kohler of Coursera reported that when an issue is raised, now note this, when an issue is raised in a MOOC forum, the mean time to someone else on the forum contributing a useful response is 22 minutes. That 22-minute response around the clock, because the course community is global. No professor, not even a Longhorn professor, could ever be that responsive. Pedagogically, it's advantageous to go online rather than in the classroom. Harvard Business School, Rabden continues, has stopped teaching statistics. Instead, it requires its students to take an online statistics course from Brigham Young University, a course that the Harvard Business School believes is better than any business course at Harvard. Can you imagine they're confessing that? Rapkin adds that when his students at the University of Michigan meet in class after having gathered information from free MOOCs, quote, the quality of the average essay in those courses has increased markedly. Furthermore, the American Council on Education is starting to give credit for successful completion of individual MOOCs. Later, Rapkin reports places like Thomas Edison State College in New Jersey, a fully accredited institution, allows students to submit portfolios of experience, including MOOC credits, to earn a degree. In other words, academic advancement is based on achievement, not seat time. Then he draws this powerful conclusion, and this conclusion makes an awful lot of people uncomfortable. If modern technology allows us to choose courses at will from a variety of sources and get a degree for less than 1/10 the cost and maybe in half the time of traditional college, what will colleges become? Well, they'll become out of business. Well, they will become colleges offering degrees for $10,000 tuition, more or less, all the while improving the quality of students' education. We all know about the exorbitant costs for going to college. It's actually more sometimes than buying a new home. The staggering debt, which right now averages, in recent figures, $29,400 for the average student borrower. $29,400. And as you know, the dropout rate is terrible. 43% of college students do not graduate. The cost, debt, and dropouts disproportionately affect low-income students. 5 hours ahead? Oh, 5 minutes, all right. They are being priced out of the market. But as Herbert Stein observed, what can't go on forever won't. The handwriting is on the wall that the dominant course format of the future will become the hybrid course, combining face-to-face classroom instruction with online instruction. Former U.S. Secretary of Education Margaret Spelling has declared, quote, by 2015, the number of students who are taking classes exclusively in physical brick and mortar spaces will shrink by 2/3. Now, what are the objections? One of the chief objections to MOOCs and other online courses come from defenders of the traditional status quo who seek self-preservation and don't like competition, and they don't like choice in higher education. And I'll give you an example of a colleague at the University of Michigan. Look what she writes. This is very revealing. She didn't like MOOCs. She didn't like online. She didn't like the 21st century. The MOOC business thrives on star quality performers. Well, you know why they do well, because when they get in front of the set, they're good. Can you imagine that? They're good. Faculty who dazzle them on the screen. That's not fair. You're supposed to give a boring lecture. We already have here's what bothers her. We already have a two-tiered professoriate made up of large numbers of non-tenured track and contingent faculty and a shrinking percentage of tenure. She wants tenure protected. Well, sure, self-preservation. What happens, she said, when we have three-tier faculty, the megastars in the STEM and math fields, the rest of the tenured faculty, and the contingent faculty? Well, what happens is choice. Choice. And it will save students money. Georgia Tech, for example, will join Udacity to offer an online master's degree in computer science for $7,000, down 80% from the existing cost of $40,000 for the on-campus instructor-led program. There is another precious value to less expensive online courses, and I regard this as a very major point. They chip away at socioeconomic barriers. In the American Enterprise Institute study, Cheap for Whom, Jorge Clorde Alba, who's a good friend, by the way, of the commissioner. They go back a long while, but we can't talk about that. Jorge Clorde Alba and Mark Schneider discovered, quote, among not-for-profit institutions, the amount of taxpayer subsidies hovers between 2 minutes, hovers between $1,000 and $2,000 per student per year until we turn to the most selective institutions. Among these already well-endowed institutions, the taxpayer subsidy jumps substantially to more than $13,000 a student. There is discrimination in the system, and it favors rich kids. They conclude, if the country is to retain its competitive edge, it must reverse the current policies that result in providing the lowest level of taxpayer support to the institution that enroll the highest percentage of low-income, non-traditional, and minority students, the fastest growing segments of the population, and especially here in Texas. For the first time in Texas history, more Hispanic students than white ones took the SAT last year. The Texas class of 2103 SAT takers represented 56% of all high school graduates. Of those, 62% identified themselves as minorities. Now, the question is, how do you teach Shakespeare? I still don't know. But I do know this. It's being taught online, and there are several institutions, I won't list them, but one of them is Tom's. He's got an organization now that works online. It's called Libertas U, and it's real-time discussion-driven seminars in the great book, so it is being done. What's more, and let me make one point, I can't cover it now, but one of the reasons the humanities are declining is because the professors are killing the humanities. The professors are killing the humanities. Ask me why, please, during the question and answer session. Nothing I enjoy more than maligning the professors who are killing Shakespeare. and they're killing Shakespeare. Damn it. Costs will drop. Increasingly, college is becoming a place mostly for wealthy students and parents. This trend can be reversed in meaningful measure. Finally, my last line, how much time do I have? It's up. Those who resist this change in the status quo should remember that they are not the ones paying the freight. There, I've told you more than I know.
Thank you, Dr. Trowbridge. We'll next hear from Dr. Raymond Paredes.
That's the last time I come up here after Ron does. I'm going to shift the focus a bit because I would argue that the issue is not administrative bloat. The issue is inefficiency. Inefficiency not only in terms of having more administrators than you need, it's inefficiency in terms of advising students, it's inefficiency in terms of managing the curriculum and maintaining a coherent whole. It's inefficiency in the way faculty teach. It's inefficiency in terms of having shifted the balance in institutions of higher education from being student-centric to being faculty-centric. And I think that if we look at the issue rather more broadly, we'll see that there are a lot of ways that we can make higher education more efficient. We can hold down the acceleration in cost by, as I said, considering the broader set of issues. About 6 or 7 years ago, there was a study done by the McKinsey Consulting Company, which I found probably the best study I've ever seen on costs in higher education. And it claimed that if you look at higher education across the board, that there's a built-in inefficiency of somewhere between 15 and 30%. In other words, that across the country, you could reduce the cost of higher education between 15 and 30%, depending on the institution, without in any way lowering the quality of education. We did some studies in Texas. For example, Governor Perry in, I think, 2010 issued the coordinating board an executive order and asked us to take a look at cost inefficiencies, and we did. And we found that there were, in fact, significant cost inefficiencies in Texas, but I'm pleased to say, and once again, pleasure is relative sometimes, that we were at the bottom of the scale rather than the top of the scale. In other words, our inefficiencies across the state were mostly in about the 15 to 18% range, not at the top of the scale as McKinsey found. Some of these inefficiencies had to do with low completion rates. They had to do, we have a number of institutions in Texas that have 6-year graduation rates of 13%. 6-year graduation rates of 13%. 15%, 20%, 30%. Our 6-year graduation rates as a state are somewhere in the range of 57%. If you pulled UT Austin and Texas A&M out of that calculation, because they are by far the two most selected public institutions in Texas and consequently have the highest completion rates, the 6-year graduation rates for Texas universities, except for those two, are about 50%. The cost of producing a graduate in Texas from a university is among the highest in the country. That has to do with the preparation of students coming to our university campuses. It has to do with how well we mentor and nurture these students so that they can finish. But there are gross inefficiencies that we could attend to quite easily. For example, nationally, the average number of courses, or the average number of hours, I should say, that students accumulate to get an associate's degree, these are national data. The average number of hours a student takes to get an associate's degree nationally is about 68. In Texas, it's 96. Nationally, the average number of hours taken to complete a bachelor's degree is about 136. In Texas, it's 147. And I'm talking about 60 hours for an associate's degree and 120 hours for a bachelor's degree. Those are great opportunities for developing more cost efficiency. We have curricula around the state where students can select from literally hundreds of courses that qualify for general education credit in the lower division curriculum. The result is, what has happened in Texas and around the country, and this gets back to the point about higher education becoming faculty-centric, that we now have a curriculum that's essentially governed and shaped not by any coherent notions about what students should leave a university or a community college knowing, but rather is pretty much shaped by the interests of the faculty. And the consequence is that we have literally hundreds of courses that are large public universities that students can take for general education credit. And we have courses that are relatively small in size. We could eliminate those courses and save an awful lot of money. But more than that, the consequence is that students graduate from college with virtually no coherent sense of what they've learned. That's not only a cost inefficiency, that's also an intellectual and educational failure. I should say that we're doing some things that we hope will improve cost efficiency in Texas. I'm sure many of you know that the University of Texas here in Austin launched an exercise, a review of its administrative structure, and eliminated hundreds of positions as a consequence. The Texas A&M system under Chancellor Sharp has taken a look at a lot of expenditures. For example, they've outsourced an awful lot of services that they provide their campuses that will improve cost efficiencies. We are actively promoting the development of more online courses. And I should say that the evidence suggests that there's no saving in the beginning, that the infrastructure that's needed, the retraining that faculty need so that Ron can teach Shakespeare online, all of that kind of training, all that kind of activity requires expenditures. So if there is a saving, and I believe there will be down the line as we increase the number of online courses or blended courses, they will not be in the initial stages of that kind of activity. We also have to take into account that one of the reasons that costs are increasing in education, this isn't an apology, it's simply a recognition of what's happened, is that universities are much more complex than they were 40, 50 years ago. When I was a faculty, a beginning faculty member at UCLA 40 years ago, I remember that we had one lawyer for the entire campus. When I retired from UCLA 30 years later, there was a staff of at least a dozen. We've proliferated staff in contracts and grants as more and more universities seek to acquire outside research funds. As state support for higher education has declined, one of the biggest areas of growth has been development staff. Yep. It's also true that we have more and more people involved in government relations now than was the case 25, 30 years ago. I'll close by talking about the $10,000 degree. We actually don't have a $10,000 degree yet. We have programs that will ultimately cost the students $10,000, but that's only if they receive certain kinds of financial aid, if they acquire a large number of dual credit hours before they even enroll in a campus, and they do other things that will reduce the cost of education. But a degree, and this is what Governor Perry meant, a degree that cost the student $10,000, no more than $10,000, once they arrived on a public university campus. We haven't achieved that yet. We will launch, beginning at the end of this month, 2 legitimate $10,000 degree programs. They were developed by South Texas College, which is one of the 3 community colleges in Texas that is authorized to offer baccalaureate degrees, and the university that will participate in offering this degree is Texas A&M Commerce. These will be legitimate $10,000 degrees. They will involve an awful lot of online courses or blended courses. At least 90 hours out of the 120 will be either entirely online or blended. They will be competency-based courses in which students are expected to accelerate their way through the curriculum. There's no research that demonstrates or proves that all students require 15 weeks to master a body of knowledge. So this will provide students who are highly motivated to finish courses in a shorter period of time. They will be asked to pass rigorous competency-based tests, and if they pass them, they can move on to the next course. If it takes them 5 weeks to master a body of knowledge, so be it. They can move on. We will have this. We will have this $10,000 degree in only one field for now: organizational leadership. It's a good generic degree that students are attracted to, and we hope that over time we will have $10,000 baccalaureates available to students in every region of the state. We do not plan that a $10,000 baccalaureate will appeal to everybody. We don't plan that every institution will offer such a degree. We're not planning that every student will be attracted to such a program. And we believe that there will be some fields that simply will be resistant to this kind of approach. But we will offer $10,000 degrees beginning this January, and we are still very much committed to cost efficiencies in higher education. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Paredes, and thank you to our 3 panelists. We now have time for question and answer. Before we do that, a couple of points. I want to gratefully acknowledge the presence of another representative here, Representative Diane Patrick. Thank you for coming, Representative Patrick. Representative Patrick is the Vice Chair of the House Higher Education Committee. Before you ask your questions, all 3 panelists have asked me to inform you that to respect their desire, they will not answer any questions about their speed in the 40-yard dash.
4-3.
He was running backwards.
4-3.
But other than that, any other questions are fair game.
Thanks, Tom.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your excellent remarks. I joined you today from Excelsior College. We are one of the sponsors of this event, and for those of you who don't know, we are one of the largest online and competency-based institutions of higher education in the country, so we're very proud of our history in working with students here in Texas, and although we have not quite gotten to the $10,000 degree, we've made great progress in approaching that figure, and probably more important, and I believe what the governor's really aiming at, is an affordable, efficient way for students to get higher education and access to it. And that's something that we've had a 40-year commitment to at Excelsior College. One question I did want to ask you that I haven't heard discussed yet today is, we are an institution of higher education at Excelsior that is focused on efficiencies and trying new things, new technologies, and new ways of teaching students. Not sure if we've quite got to the teaching Shakespeare online perfectly yet, but we are endeavoring to do that. But one of the things that we consistently face as a challenge, and I know many other institutions do too, is we don't quite have the partnership we'd like with the U.S. Department of Education, which consistently visits lots of regulatory requirements on us and other institutions of higher education, gainful employment, regulations, which we have been grappling with over the last few years. And this generates a need for administrative staff at the university level just to address the need to face these regulations, gather the information necessary to comply with them. And so I wonder if some of you could comment about the challenges that facing that heavy regulatory authority from Washington poses to institutions as they try to reduce administrative costs.
Any of you gentlemen want to address that?
I'll address it.
I have had conversations with authorities in Washington and the Department of Education, members of the Texas delegation, about opening up educational opportunities from your sector. As I'm sure you know, in Texas 4 years ago, we significantly lowered the barriers for non-traditional for-profit institutions to open up operations in Texas, and our idea was that we would make it easier for institutions to begin operations in Texas, but we would monitor them to make sure that they were producing high-quality education, and we have closed down some of the schools that haven't met our educational standards. As you know, we gather data from colleges like yours, and we include those data in terms of our overall education, or data on educational attainment and the number of graduates we produce. So we recognize that your sector is critical to making certain that our young people in Texas have as many opportunities to get a college education as possible. The mood in Washington, particularly in the U.S. Department of Education, is different. I don't know if that's likely to change. There's no evidence that it will during this current administration, but I can tell you that we encourage high-quality work of your type in Texas, and we will be as supportive as we can.
Could I add just one footnote? He knows much more about this than I do. But one of the problems now in moving to online is that you're moving from seat time to performance-based. You do it on achievement, not how long you sit there. That makes sense. How can you gain more in a lecture hall with 200 kids than watching a computer yourself? The problem is, how do you measure performance? How is that determined? I have no idea, but there's going to be a major problem. Prove to us that online and performance-based works. I can't do that, but somebody's going to have to do it.
I'm pretty sure that we can. We have probably the most sophisticated battery of competency-based assessments in the nation, and I'd say that, I welcome anybody on the panel or the room in the state to take a look at the work that we're doing at Excelsior. I think we find some persuasive evidence that we have very high-quality ways of doing that.
Representative Murphy?
Yeah, let me just want to make a couple points relative to your comment. First off, I don't want to speak for Congress. I think that'd be a career-limiting move in my position.
Don't lower yourself.
I'm a Texas
All right.
guy and very happy about it. I wish they would leave it up to us to do these sorts of regulations. But a concern I've gotten from my constituents is the amount of student debt people are incurring, particularly at these non-traditional colleges, and wanting to make sure that if they get a degree, it's relevant and it's going to provide them a real job opportunity and not just a big ticket to pay for when they hopefully graduate or worse, drop out, as the data shows. It's interesting, the data I saw, and I was trying to find the reference, and I apologize for not having it, but that the regulatory costs have increased at a greater level in our private institutions than they have at our public institutions. Meaning that all the mandates they talk about from the state and federal government have been less so on the state schools than they have on the private schools. So that's kind of an outlier, if you will, for data. But this notion of value and of debt is something we need to drill down to, and we need to work in partnership with the feds. As I mentioned, we're a very spread out state, and online allows people in small communities or in off hours to do these things. We need to figure out a way to make that work. So.
Thank you. I would just add that, as you notice here, we're talking a lot about online learning, and the reason for that is because when Governor Perry issued his challenge to craft $10,000 degrees, he specifically stated as the means toward that end, leveraging web-based technologies and using competency-based exams. So that's what he had in mind. And also, something that gets missed sometimes, the governor only asked that the $10,000 degree apply to 10% of all college degrees awarded. So it was not the notion here that you could take all degrees and simply make them $10,000. That wasn't what he was asking for. As far as measuring the value of online learning versus traditional learning, the Department of Education itself in 2009 issued a meta-analysis of 44 separate studies of online learning, and it came to the conclusion that online learning, especially in the form known as hybrid or blended learning, which is some face time in a traditional classroom and then receiving content online, that actually, students actually scored higher in learning outcomes than did students in either a traditional classroom or in a wholly online setting. So, and you know, the development in online learning is advancing daily. It's becoming more interactive. It can adjust to the student's learning style and therewith quiz the student at certain points in which are needed in order to prove development. So those of us who think that, well, an online course is just watching somebody talk on a computer, that was 10 years ago. That's not the case today. It's changing, and it's changing for the better. And then one last point here. We should measure the quality of online courses and $10,000 degrees. But let's make no mistake. Traditional education today, as we know from Academically Adrift, a landmark national study of collegiate learning, published in 2011, it found that in our traditional universities, paid for by our tax dollars, that 36% of all college students across the country, after 4 years invested in college, show little to no increase in fundamental academic skills. We also know from the same national study that in the early 1960s, students studied 24 hours a week. Today, they study 14 hours a week. So we've got students studying half as much. We've got over a third of students getting nothing out of college. Right? But we also have, during this same period, in the early 1960s, 15% of all college grades were A's. Today, 43% of all college grades are A's. And A is the most common grade in college across the country. So, yes, we should measure online learning quality, but let's do so mindful of how we got to this point in the first place. Other questions?
This is a question coming as a parent of 3 college students so far and 1 coming up. I wonder if a $10,000 degree might be more obtainable if curriculums were more directed solely at the degree. And I mean, I understand the need for a well-rounded education, but for example, my oldest son is a petroleum engineer, and he called what he had to take painful electives, like philosophy, and if anyone knows what engineers like, no philosophy class will help him. And my daughter got a degree in broadcasting journalism, and one of the courses that I had to pay for was hip-hop feminism. And my son is at UT now in pre-med, and last year I had to pay for the history of rock and roll. So I'm wondering if perhaps there's a way to consolidate more curriculum into what the degree is, and maybe not so much on electives that we have to pay for. So.
Any of the 3 of you?
Well, I'll just mention, because I know Dr. Paredes, we followed this bill quite a bit. Last session, we had a bill talking about the history issue, where students were required to take American history, and we've certified a whole host of other histories, like rock and roll, among others, that you can take instead of American history. Washington, Jefferson, really? And so now it's what, Zeppelin and airplane or something? So I would just say that I think it's time for us to kind of rein that in. I'd like to take this opportunity to kind of kick it back to Commissioner Paredes. And there may be a misunderstanding on your part, and there was really until I started serving on the committee, of what the role of the coordinating board is. Can they just tell these colleges, you know, stop doing that? And how does that occur? And Raymond, y'all have done good jobs in terms of providing us data and actionable information. but the process is a little more complicated than that. Could you kind of opine a bit?
Well, first of all, let me respond by saying I think a philosophy course could be invaluable to an engineer. I'm not so sure about the history of rock and roll, but those are not courses that are required. Those are courses that your children took of their own volition. They could have taken a course in the history of the American Constitution, or they could have taken a course in the history of the Supreme Court. They opted to take the history of rock and roll. So that's probably a conversation you need to have with your kids. The way we have a core curriculum, and we have set standards in terms of a certain number of courses have to be in the humanities, some have to be in the social sciences, some have to be in the sciences. And then we establish criteria for what general learning outcomes should be in all these undergraduate lower division courses that qualify for general education credit. And as you know, these are courses that you take typically in your first and second year of college before you go on to courses in the major. Universities have a lot of latitude, which they've insisted upon, to let their faculty, let academic departments determine what courses qualify for credit under any of those disciplinary categories. I don't think there's any question we've gone too far in letting faculty designate any number of courses to fit certain criteria. I think it's shameful that a student can graduate from a university and know nothing about the Constitution, know nothing about the Bill of Rights, and yet it's entirely possible that might occur.
The Supreme Court doesn't know about the Constitution.
I think it's another seminar today.
I think that we need to help institutions go back and review their curricula and make sure that they're coherent and manageable.
We've got a number of hands up, so go ahead and
more of a comment than a question. I actually received a $10,000 degree from A&M in 1969 in chemical engineering. And that wasn't tuition and fees, that was the whole shooting match.
Yeah, shebang, yeah.
The difference was, I think then, of course, cheaper, but the other part was I went there to get an education. When my daughter went there, she went to have an experience. And when she first got there, she was told, nobody gets through in 4 years. And I said, well, that may be true, but Daddy's paying for 4 years. She took 6, but she paid for the last 2. But the point was, there are many things beyond her control that would not allow her to complete a 4-year degree plan. And the other point with relative to philosophy and engineering, I wish I had had more liberal arts in my undergraduate degree. Would have probably served me better than some of the things I took that were technical, particularly since I never really made a living as a chemical engineer.
any comments? I'm afraid that we have time for only one more question.
Good. Mr. Throwbridge threw out the concept, that we are moving toward performance-based in Texas instead of butts in a seat. In business, we know we get what we pay for in our employees, and we're getting what we pay for because our incentive is for butts in a seat, and the resistance from colleges and universities that they don't want to shift to performance because they don't get paid for that. They get paid for the butts in the seat. Texas State Technical College, for instance, produces people with associate degrees. They get a 98% placement of every student that comes out of that college because they're teaching them what is needed in the workplace. I'm a businessman in South Texas. As I go around South Texas, everywhere you look, there are signs that say, help wanted, drivers wanted. I have a son that's a chemie, runs a plant in Houston. but I've got a son that's a truck driver. He makes $60,000 a year in driving 18-wheelers, CDL, and a hazmat. Nothing wrong with that. But we're directed at the wrong thing when we talk about paying for butts in a seat.
Let me respond to that. The legislature did pass last session performance-based funding for 2 sectors of higher education, the technical colleges that you're talking about and community colleges. The legislature did not pass performance-based funding for universities, and the performance metrics we've recommended include graduating more students, graduating them in a more timely fashion, more explicitly meeting the workforce needs of Texas. I hope that this organization, and I hope that people in the audience will support performance-based or outcomes-based funding for universities. The coordinating board will propose that legislation again this session.
Well, let me just say on behalf of Diane and I, because we loved that idea, we supported that idea, and you know, the notion that it was resisted, I want to be real clear. The community colleges and technical schools were all for this. They said we'd rather be measured by performance because we think we're pretty good. They're all like Scott Turner. So I love Scott, that's okay. So, but I said the university element's a little more complicated, and hopefully we'll get there.
Let me just say, as a trustee of one of the largest community college systems in the country, we have 6 campuses and about 80,000 students. All we do is to figure out how to get those kids to graduate.
Right.
That's all we're thinking about now. How do we get them to graduate? What do we do? You go to a seminar that we feature, it's all, how do we get them through? How do we get, what do we do? What do we do? Because the results, except at UT and A&M, are pretty disastrous in this state. Pretty disastrous. We work on it.
We'll have to end it on that note. Please join me in welcoming our, thank you.